بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله الحمد لله والشكر لله. We are almost at the end of what I would describe as the most challenging part of the text. That is to say, once we finish this area and master it, we'll find the rest of the text very easy to understand. And that is because the rest of the text is based upon the foundations that we are establishing here in the beginning. We spoke for some time about these foundations, the building blocks of understanding, in order to properly approach the study of Aqidah. And one may ask, why should we complicate things like this? Did the Sahaba need to learn complicated formulas? Did they have to learn technical definitions? Did they have to learn about these different categories? And the answer is no. And the reason why they didn't have to learn these things is for two main reasons. The first reason, which I feel is the most important, is that they already understood these things intuitively, as many people do who have a sound fitrah, and they are able to derive these foundations and understandings from the text and from their own minds, basic observations. And there was no need for them to elaborate in detail about these ways of thinking, categorizing the different judgments to hukum shar'i, legal judgment, empirical judgment, and rational judgment. There was no need for them. Just as they had no need for organizing what came to be known as usulul fiqh, or the theoretical basis for law, legal theory. They didn't need to lay out the details that we have in usul al-fiqh, because everything was received directly from the Prophet ﷺ, and much of these principles were understood through their ghariza, their nature, and the malaka fiqhiyya, the natural aptitude they had by virtue of being in that environment. The second reason why they didn't need this elaboration is because there was no need in society for it to be done. We can use a really good example with the Arabic language. The Sahaba, and indeed the generations before them, were masters in the Arabic language because it was not polluted, it was not mixed with other languages. It was in a preserved container, if you will, because they were in the Hijaz, and there was no interference in that process. So the Arabs of the time had what we call a malaka. They had a natural aptitude in speaking precise, pristine, pure Arabic. And we see that in the way they would speak. We see that in the Jahili poetry that is preserved and still memorized today. This means that in their time, because they had that natural aptitude and they were in a pure Arabic environment, they didn't need to write out the rules of grammar. They didn't need to make lists of categories and principles on which we learn the language. That came later on. And we actually know a bit about that development when we study the history of Arabic and how it developed as a science the science of grammar, for instance, we see the narration from Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali, and it's related in a number of narrations. Imam al-Suyuti gathered them together in a book. There's a couple of narrations, actually. The first narration mentions that as more and more people began to embrace Islam from the Rum and the Furs, the area of Byzantium and Persia, a lot of the Ajam, the non-Arabs, were now migrating into the Hijaz, into Medina and Mecca. And these are now new Muslims who are learning Arabic as their second language. As they're learning the Arabic language, they're obviously struggling with learning it without having textbooks. They're having to pick it up from the environment. And this means that obviously as they learn, they're going to make mistakes, as we all make mistakes when learning a second language. That's a part of learning the language. In fact, the best way to learn a language is to make a lot of mistakes in it and get corrected, because you don't forget those things. So it's mentioned in one narration that one of these new Muslims who had learned Arabic was reciting the Quran. And he was reciting a verse in the beginning of the 9th chapter of the Quran, Surah Tawbah, and he read it incorrectly by putting the wrong vowel mark on one of the words. And this fundamentally changed the meaning of the verse. He was not discovered to have made this mistake by a companion. He was making this mistake and reading it over and over again, to the point where even some of the Muslims from the Bedouin Arabs who knew Arabic were hearing it from the new Muslim non-Arabs. And they don't know any better, so they're starting to copy the non-Arabs, or this non-Arab in particular, who made the error. The verse in question is in the beginning of Surah Tawbah, where Allah Ta'ala says, Inna Allaha bari'un min al-mushrikina wa rasuluh. The meaning of this verse is, verily Allah is free, disavows himself, free of the idol worshippers. Wa rasuluhu, and his messenger. Wallahu bari'un min al-mushrikina wa rasuluhu. This is the ayah. Wallahu, with Dhamma, Allah is free from the idol worshippers. Wa rasuluhu, also with Dhamma, and his messenger is also free of the idol worshippers. This non-Arab recited the verse incorrectly. He recited it as Wallahu bari'un min al-mushrikina wa rasulihi. So this means Allah is free of the idol worshippers and free of his messenger. So the wow is what we call wow al-atf, it's a conjunction. So grammatically, he placed rasuluhu in the place of mushrikeen in terms of receiving the same hukum, the same statement. So one time, this Bedouin Arab was reading the verse in this way, making a mistake. Wallahu bari'un min al-mushrikina wa rasulihi. And Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu heard him reciting the verse this way. And you can imagine how he felt when he heard that. He became very upset. And he grabbed this guy up and asked him, where did you hear this? Who told you that? And he said, this is how I heard it from so-and-so. And when this occurred, Sayyidina Umar realized something. He realized that in order to preserve the language of the Quran, we must organize the principles of the language so the new Muslims who are non-Arabs can know the principles of Arabic so they don't make mistakes in reciting the Quran. Because remember, this is in the age before the Mus'haf had diacritical marks. If you read it, it's without any harakat. So he tasked, in one narration it says that Imam Ali was tasked with writing the rules of Arabic. This was a first-time endeavor to write down rules and principles for something that had until that point been intuitive and picked up by the people as their own language because they grew up in the environment. Anyhow, for this, the point of this long story is that they didn't have a need for those principles being explained in that manner. But when the need arose, they set about writing books that explain these principles. And the same for Aqidah. And that's why we learn these things. So we spent a few weeks talking about epistemology. How do we know what we know? This is really important, we said, because Allah Ta'ala tells us in the Quran, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. As a command, He says, know that there is no God but Allah. There's no deity worthy of worship except Allah. This is a divine command to attain knowledge of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. So if we're to fulfill that divine command, we have to know, what does it really mean to know? What is knowledge and what isn't knowledge? And so we set about explaining the meaning of knowledge in the area of theology, and we said it is al-jazm al-mutabiq lil-waqi' an dalil. It is to have a conviction that is congruent, matching the reality based on a proof. So this means that we have conviction. The conviction matches what is reality, and it's based on a proof. We talked about how to know what we know, the sources of knowledge. We talked about what is standing in the place of knowledge but is not knowledge. So you have the opposite, whether that is jahl, ignorance, simple ignorance, or compound ignorance. We also talked about dhann, which is a true guess. It is getting the answer right, but not having the idrak, the means of access. We talked about wahm, which is conjecture. It's the false guess. It's guessing and being wrong, which is a kind of compound ignorance. And we talked about doubt, and we talked about taqleed, just going along with what others say about the issue without having access ourselves. So the objective is for us to have true knowledge about the tenets of faith, about Allah, what we believe regarding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the absolute, and what are His attributes. And in order to have that knowledge, we have to understand what it means to know. And we have to understand what a judgment is. Because when we say we believe something, to make a jazm, to have a conviction, to say, I believe Allah is all-powerful. Allah is all-powerful. That's a hukum. It's a judgment. So there has to be a proof for that judgment. A proof for that statement has to be given. Either we know it and can articulate it, or we just know it inside of ourselves, but we can't really explain it to people in a cogent, clear way. Or if someone brought up some argument, we wouldn't be able to respond, but we know it ourselves. It doesn't mean that we have to know it at the level of a mutakallim, theologian, who can engage in debates and dialogue with people of different faiths and have a back and forth with them. That's not required, but we have to know. And that's why we focus on the epistemology, and we focus on knowing what is the hukum. And we talked about the three types of judgments there are for us as Muslims. We said there is before we do that, because today is mostly a day of review and solidifying what we've learned and looking at more examples. So we talked about hukum. We talked about the judgment and what it is. Does anyone remember what is the definition of a judgment? Either Arabic or English is fine. A judgment. Not a specific kind of judgment, but just the word, the term judgment.
Affirm or negotiating something which requires proof.
Yeah, it is to affirm something for something else. Think of the example of A is B, like you see on the board. There on the board, you see A is B. And you see also below that, A is not B. Both of these are an example of a hukum, a judgment. What is the relation between A and B, that's called the nisbah. The relation is the nisbah. Where do we see the relation here? It's is. So that's the ithbat, the affirmation. A is B. You are affirming that A is B. That's an affirmation, ithbat. Ithbatu amrin li amrin, or nafyuhu anhu. A is not B. Again, the nisbah, the ascription, is in the brackets, is not. So what you're saying here, you're negating one from the other. You're negating that A could be B. That doesn't sound right. Could be B. Anyhow, it's, if you're visual in your learning style, writing this down and paying attention to the structure will be very helpful. So it is affirming one thing for another or negating one thing from another. If we use the example of A and B, we can rework the definition and say that the judgment is affirming A for B or negating A from B. It doesn't really matter what A stands for or what B stands for. If you're affirming A for B or negating A from B, in either case you are making a judgment. And we said that whenever you make a judgment, you have to do what? You have to have proof for it. Now, a person can make a judgment and run away when asked to give a proof. But the point we're making is if a person makes a judgment, the burden is on them to back that up. They don't have the right to make a judgment and when asked to provide proof, run away and say, no, I don't have to prove anything. You have to prove the opposite. That's not the case because they're making a judgment. Any judgment, whether it is an affirmation or a negation, requires proof, requires something to substantiate it. It doesn't matter what it is. And the reason why we use A and B is because it doesn't really matter what it is. Now, we said in one of the previous classes that in the study of Aqidah, or really any study, when we're looking at judgments, we understand that the judgment can be a lot more complex than a simple A is B, A is not B. That's a very simple judgment. A is B. Zayd is standing. It's very simple. How do you substantiate it? I see him. That's a proof. I see him standing. Zayd is not standing. That's a negation. And you back it up through observation, through someone conveying it to you, and they're trustworthy. There's ways of knowing, right? So that's a simple example. But when you go into more detailed issues, the hukm can be a lot more involved. What would stand for A could be a really long sentence that has a detailed kind of description of a thing. And then comes the ascription, the is, and then comes the other side, the B, which could also be very long. It often becomes a question of language. When we say, this thing over here, which is described as X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and it has this quality and that quality, and is not to be confused with A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, is similar to blah, 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 blah. That's a judgment. You have to find in that judgment what is the A and what is the B, as complex as it is. So, but just knowing the basic building blocks is where we're starting and what's important here. So we said that the hukm takes on three categories, or it consists of three types. There is the first one, al-hukmu al-shar'i, the legal judgment, and that is in the domain of fiqh, of Islamic law. We're not concerning ourselves with that in this science. That is in fiqh. But any fiqh judgment is still an affirmation or negation. Drinking alcohol is haram. Drinking alcohol is A. Is the nisbah. Haram is B. That's a judgment. Wearing a purple hat is neutral. Mubah. Praying, fasting in Ramadan for those who are able is wajib. This is a legal judgment. But that's not what we're concerning ourselves with in the science of Aqidah, though we do talk about it in the beginning when we mention the first obligation on the person who's attained maturity. The second hukum is really important, and that is called hukum adi, the hukum adi. And the hukum adi is the scientific judgment or the empirical judgment. And we said that the empirical judgment is based on al-hiss, it's based on sensory perception, observation through the human senses, or what would enhance those senses, microscope, telescope, as well as takrar, repetition, testing, experimentation, observation, looking for patterns. And through those patterns, we establish a norm for something in nature. That's the domain of science. Science is the domain of ada, of empirical judgment, observation. It can't speak to metaphysical truths. It can't speak about things outside of the domain of the observable and measurable. And that's what we would call scientism, where science is elevated beyond its own domain and elevated to a place beyond science. Because even the principles of science, the axiomatic principles of science, are actually beyond science. They're not measurable. They're metaphysical statements, right? But we'll get to that later on. If a person says, I don't believe in metaphysics, I don't believe in anything beyond science, I believe that science is true, we tell them, you're saying science is true. That is not a scientific statement that can be observed in a laboratory. You can't test that, right? That statement is a metaphysical statement. So you have to engage in higher thinking beyond just the physical measurement of things. But the hukum adi is important for us because it is the way we establish what is scientifically possible or scientifically impossible, at least for the time being, unless we discover some way of it being possible. And we talk a lot about this in Aqidah. But our primary judgment that we study in Aqidah is the third one, and that is called al-hukmu al-aqli. We translate al-hukmu al-aqli as the rational judgment, but you can also call it the intellectual judgment or the logical judgment. What is the main difference, the essential difference between the empirical judgment, al-hukm al-adi, and the rational judgment, al-hukm al-aqli? What's the main difference?
Rational judgment doesn't depend on observation.
Very good. Very good. This is so important. The rational judgment does not depend on Sharia, nor does it depend on ada, empirical observation. Imam Ibn Ashir, he says in Al-Murshid Al-Mu'in, وَحُكْمُنَا الْعَقْلِي قَضِيَّةٌ بِلَا وَقْفٍ عَلَى عَادَةٍ أَوْ وَضْعٍ جَلَى. He boils it down into one line of poetry and says, our rational judgment is that which does not depend on a legal judgment, a sharia, or observation through ada, empirical judgment. This is to say, when 1 plus 1 equals 2 as a rational judgment does not depend on revelation, doesn't depend on a verse of Quran or a hadith to affirm it, nor does it depend on experimentation, observing it in nature, taking it to a laboratory, and putting it under a microscope. It is a rational judgment, independent of what we observe in nature and independent of revealed knowledge. Right? This is the essential distinction. Anyone who tries to make the rational judgment subject to revelation is incoherent. They're mixing up terms. We have to understand the rational judgment because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is qualified with certain attributes that are necessary for Him rationally. Meaning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the necessary existent, the necessary being, and He has certain necessary qualities, which means that there are other qualities that are rationally impossible, that He cannot possess. Because if He possessed those other attributes, then that would, by definition, that would not be the creator of the heavens and the earth, the absolute being. So we have to learn the rational judgments, what they are, so that when we learn those things, we understand how to situate them. Yes?
Can't you observe the one and one skill?
You're observing it with your sensory perception. If you take a marble and put another marble together, you see one joined with the other. But the judgment you arrive at, that this makes two, is not dependent on the sensory perception. So you're using your observation, but the judgment you make is not done by the observation itself. It's the aql that is filtering that, right? So the sensory perception cannot give the judgment. It's a tool, but it can't give the judgment. The judgment is given based on us thinking about it, making a rational judgment. Does that make sense? So yes, you can observe things in nature and then you come to conclusions based on the observation. But the tools of observation, the eyes, the ears, these are not the things making that decision. They're not making coming to the conclusion. They're just the tools of arriving at the judgment, but they're not. The aql gives the judgment, and the faculties facilitate it through observation. Yes.
With this point, 1 plus 1, 2, we make the judgment, it's 2. So one thing is not the only observation help us to reach to the conclusion which is rational, but and how about that area when we growing up we hear from others 1 plus 1, 2, but it's still when we for sure ourselves reach, and when it's my judgment, that is the time which for us we reach to the judgment. Before that, like we are growing up, we are here also. Beside observing, we hear also when we learn that 1 plus 1 in the schools, and how about that part?
If a person is studying math or they're a young child and the parents tell them that 5 times 5 is 25, they believe their parents, and they haven't reached the age of studying multiplication. So 5 times 5 equals 25. Can't be other than that. But to arrive at that judgment, it is nadari. It is non-self-evident. One has to think about it for a moment, depending on their level of skill in math and their experience. So if a person believes it on the authority of another, that is not ilm in their case, it's taqleed. And if they reach a level of knowledge in math where they can understand it on their own, they now have ilm about that thing. On the question of observing 1 plus 1 equaling 2 in nature, using the example of the 2 marbles, putting one marble together with another, what exactly are you doing when you put them together and make that observation? This in Arabic is called tasawwur. This is a very important term. I didn't include it in the list, but it's used in the science of aqidah and logic. Tasawwur is to conceptualize, is to have a conception about something. What is it? Tasawwur comes from the word surah, image or form. It is to formulate the idea. Here, when you put the two marbles together, or you're observing something in nature with your senses, the senses are the means or the tools for that tasawwur, for that conceptualization. But there's something else that has to be done before we arrive at a judgment. And that is tasdeeq. And tasdeeq is the acknowledgement or the confirmation of a judgment. And these two go together, at-tasawwur wa tasdeeq. So for instance, you observe that it's raining outside. From that observation, with your senses, your mind concludes that it's wet outside. And from that, there's other judgments. I should do this. I should put on a raincoat, get an umbrella, whatever. You have to have both of these together. The senses are the tools of that tasawwur. But it is the aql that is making the tasdeeq, that is acknowledging what's the conclusion I draw from this observation. The senses are not the same thing as the intellect. The intellect is taking all the information in through the senses and the imagination and all in the memory and mixing it all together, and then from that we arrive at a particular judgment, conclusion. So the senses are important, but they're not essential, because a person without those senses can still arrive at the judgment that 1 + 1 = 2. A blind person doesn't need to see two objects together to understand that 1 + 1 = 2. A person who is deaf doesn't have to hear that in order to understand that it's true rationally. And this is why we say that the rational judgment doesn't depend on the ada. The ada, the empirical phenomena, nature, can be used as a way of reflecting. We're looking at the ayat of Allah Ta'ala, the signs in creation. We reflect on the ayat, and from that reflection, we come to a conclusion. But the actual rational judgment isn't dependent on that observation, such that if one wasn't able to observe, they couldn't come to a conclusion that 1 + 1 = 2. Does that make sense? Yes.
So I made him count them, and he found out that they both were 8.
You bring up a good point, and we mentioned this in the previous class, and we want to reiterate it today as well, and I put it there on the board. When we're talking about rational judgments, the ulama say that a rational judgment, whether that thing is necessary, impossible, or possible, it is either self-evident or it is not self-evident. We say daruri or nadari. Daruri means you don't have to think about it. It comes like that. 1 + 1 = 2. You don't have to spend 5 minutes thinking about that. You don't need to have a long conversation about this and unpack it to arrive at that understanding. It's like this. It is self-evident. On the other hand, nadari literally means something requiring forethought, reflection, contemplation. You have to think about it. It's not self-evident. It doesn't come like that. 1 plus 1 minus 1 plus 3 times 7. I don't even know what that would be. But whatever that is, if you write it on paper or verbalize it, the person who answers it will have to think about it for a moment and work through the steps to come to the answer. The answer is, in the case of math, necessary, rationally necessary, but it takes time to get to that conclusion. The majority of the examples used are nadari. They take some amount of thought. And a lot of the examples we were bringing up in the previous class, minus 3 or 4, they were all nadari. They required some thinking. They didn't come just like that. And that brings us to where we left off in continuing with the examples. Yes?
Question is, when we're saying it doesn't need the ayat of the signs of Allah Ta'ala, this is not the only thing to reach for the conclude judgment, correct? So suppose if there's a blind person, can you introduce? There's other things also, not depend on the ayat. I mean, you're saying that. So the other things will be there is experience, the knowledge, and for a blind person, I'm saying.
So the question is, what are the means of knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How do we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's a very detailed question, to be honest. And our starting point is that we have a fitrah. The fitrah, however, when it's healthy and sound, it gives us access to that necessary knowledge about the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, untainted. But if it's tainted, it may be clouded, right? So we can't use the fitrah on its own as a proof because it's not falsifiable. Meaning, a person can't just say, I believe X, Y, Z about the Creator because that's the fitrah. Because anyone can claim that their belief is the fitrah and no one has access to know, well, is your fitrah tainted or untainted? That on its own isn't a proof. But I mean, ideally, a person with fitrah will have this intuitive understanding about the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In terms of arriving at that understanding, it could be through observing the signs and coming to the conclusion. It could be hearing about the signs. It could be reflecting about the signs within themselves. And those signs exist within themselves, whether they're blind or seeing, hearing or deaf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ. We will show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves. So there's no case where a person is blind or deaf, lacking access in such a way that they couldn't know their Creator. No one's going to be able to come on the Day of Judgment and say, I had no way of knowing who you are, Ya Allah. Right? The only people who don't have that access are people who are lacking in aql. People who don't have a functioning aql, and we call them majaneen. We call them literally insane. Or they lack the intellectual faculty. But what does that look like? Right? The fuqaha, the scholars, they define who is the majnoon person who is not accountable in Sharia, and they give different definitions and descriptors. Sometimes they'll say it's the person who doesn't know their right from their left, their up and from their down. They're not even safe to be by themselves necessarily or with others. They wouldn't know how to cross the street and buy and sell. But these are all limited definitions. But for our purposes, it's the person who doesn't know that 1 plus 1 has to equal 2. They just have no mental capacity for understanding even that. But for everyone else, we can know. It's so obvious. The way we learn it here is not anything but a way of understanding it on a deeper level, beyond the level of the villager, who doesn't really need this level of detail. So the rational judgment, reading into the poem again, it says, understand, grasp, and soon you'll realize the rational judgments in your mind's eye. A rational judgment is one of three. The first of them is called necessary. For example, 1 plus 2 equals 3. Since in our mind's eye we know this must be. The second judgment's called impossible, like saying a thing's both moving and still.
I kept thinking about that statement.
Which one? Number 10.
Both, yes, both moving and still. What about us as people being still, but our breath makes us move?
When we say that a thing cannot be both moving and still at the same time, we mean from the same vantage point. So I'll give you the example of a person in a car. Is it possible for the person in the car to be both moving and still at the same time? Yes and no. It depends on the vantage point. We would say yes, it's possible for a person in a moving car to be moving and still, because we observe them from our vantage point. We see the car driving down the road and they're a passenger. As a passenger, they're sitting perfectly still. But from our vantage point, because they're in the car, we see them moving. So from our vantage point, they are moving and still at the same time, but only from the perspective of us, with our own vision as the vantage point, observing them being in the car, moving in the moving car, and physically still in the car. But from the same vantage point, and the person in themselves, let's imagine there's a person who is suspended in space. From the single vantage point, can an object be both moving and still at the same time? That's not possible, because moving by definition means moving, right? Motion. And still means the lack of motion. So when we say that something moving and still is impossible, we mean at the same time from the same vantage point. And that's because movement has a meaning and stillness has a meaning. And both of these meanings cancel out the other. It's like saying A, which is defined as not B, is B, which is defined as not A. Both of them cancel the other out. That's impossible. And we're going to look at some of these now. The second judgment is called impossible, like saying a thing is both moving and still. The third, possible, might be or not be, like affirming a walking, talking tree. We said that the definition of the rational judgment is the judgment made by the rational mind, and it's either wajib, mustahil, or jaiz. These are the three Arabic terms. We call it wujub, aqli, right? We say, or istihala, aqliya. There's different ways we can express it in Arabic. And we said that the wujub, the rational necessity, is that which the aql cannot conceive as not existing. It cannot not be. It's a double negative. It's actually easier to start with the impossible before starting with the necessary, in English at least, because it's a double negative in English. It cannot not be. In other words, it must be. And that comes out in the poem. The rational necessity must be. It cannot not be. In Arabic, it's so much easier. ما لا يتصور في العقل عدمه. That which the mind cannot conceive of, its adam, its non-existence. Right? 1 plus 1 is 2. Could it be other than that? No. It has to be that. It cannot be other than that. It must be 2. That's the rational necessity, or we call it is rationally necessary. The istihala, the impossibility, is the exact opposite. It cannot be. ما لا يتصور في العقل وجوده. A square circle, that cannot be, because square means it has 4 sides. Circle means it has no sides. It's a contradiction in terms. Anytime you find something that is rationally impossible, you're finding something that is a contradiction in terms. It's word salad. It's word salad. A square circle, you can put the words together, but it doesn't mean anything. You can't put anything together from that. And then the possible is anything it can be, it might be, or it might not be. And what was the example we mentioned in the last class? It was on the spot. I think it was something like a flying purple mouse or something. The mind can conceive of that.
Flying cow.
Oh, flying cow, not mouse. A flying cow. The mind can conceive of it. We might not have observed a cow ever flying unaided. Could be in an airplane, but unaided. But that doesn't mean it's rationally impossible. It just means it's empirically impossible for the time being, unless we discover some ways to make cows fly. Unlikely to happen, but who knows? But rationally speaking, you can conceive of it. That means it's possible. And a lot of people, we said, they confuse between the empirical judgment and rational judgment. So in their minds, if it's scientifically impossible, it's rationally impossible too. In their minds, any miracle that is scientifically impossible must also be logically impossible. And this is ridiculous. It's a confusion. It is mixing categories. The splitting of the moon is rationally possible. There's nothing in the aql that says this cannot be envisioned. Scientifically, we would say, based on at least our current limitations, it's not possible to do that. So we'd say empirically, that's not possible. But we can't make a category error and say it's therefore rationally impossible. You understand? It's very important to understand the distinction between the rational impossibility and the scientific impossibility, which is always open for change. It may be possible at some point in the future. We don't know. Now, we gave examples in the previous class, and I asked you all to bring examples, and I have some more. So were any of you able to come up with some other examples? And remember, we said that the key to mastering this is to understand, what do you mean in the hukum for A, and what do you mean for B? If A and B are inseparable, you have necessary. If A and B mutually contradict each other and cancel each other out, that's impossible. If A and B might or might not occur, then this is a possibility. So let's hear some examples, and I have some more as well.
I just want to ask something before example.
Sure.
So scientific area, empirical area has limit and boundaries eventually, but the rational is like open, doesn't look is much wider.
Right.
Drawing boundaries.
Right, because in empirical judgments, you're observing. you're observing with your senses. And through that observation with your senses, you arrive at a judgment. This is why the empirical judgment involves observation, repetition, testing, experimentation. So through that process, you arrive at a norm. This compound, when I mix it with water and drink it, it gets rid of people's headaches 99% of the time. I've established something of a norm by observing how this particular substance interacts with the bodies of people who are suffering from headaches. That's basic science. We could do different types of tests, do placebo tests, double-blind studies. There's different ways, but that's all aada. The rational judgment is far beyond observation. It's making a rational judgment that doesn't depend on the limitations of the observable world, right? So you have some examples.
I have one, and it's one that's very popular. That Allah rested on the seventh day after He created the earth.
We'll definitely talk about these things, but I want to escape for now.
Am I jumping the gun?
Well, yeah, I want to avoid any example that is connected to theology as such, because we're going to look at those examples precisely later on. We just want to look at some general examples.
Tawbah and istighfar are the same thing.
Well, that will be a legal judgment, and it depends on how we're defining the two, and those definitions are coming from the Sharia. So we're looking at a Sharia judgment there.
As an individual, I believe that when I make istighfar, is that the same thing as making tawbah?
So istighfar, seeking forgiveness, and tawbah, repentance, are two different things. To say that there's a difference or that they're the same is discovered in revelation. It's discovered in Sharia, which means that whatever we say about seeking forgiveness or whatever we say about repentance is in the domain of the hukum shar'i, the legal judgment. It's based on revelation. And in part based on the Arabic language, but ultimately it's based on revelation. So that wouldn't be in the category of a rational judgment. That would be in the category of the legal judgment. It's like saying, can I make wudu with Kool-Aid or must I make it with water? If we use that as a rational judgment, yes, rationally speaking, a person could do the act of wudu with Kool-Aid. Rationally, we can conceive a person doing that, but as far as its status in Sharia, that's a hukum shari, a legal judgment. And the answer is no, you can't make wudu with Kool-Aid. The water has to be pure and purifying. So there is, of course, some observation going on for that. That's the tasawwur, that's conceiving of the issue. But the actual judgment we make is based on Sharia in that case. For the issue of tawbah versus istighfar, or making wudu with Kool-Aid versus water, right? So I think we did mention in the previous class that it's harder to think of examples for things that are rationally necessary than things that are rationally impossible. But I'll take any example you have, if you've thought up of any. You need breath to be alive. Is that a rational judgment or an empirical judgment? So are you saying it's rationally necessary? Is it possible for...
I'm thinking of like somebody who can't breathe and then they're relying in a hospital and
The science still they are giving them
they're still living, they're remaining alive and they don't breathing.
Well, even without the artificial breathing, without any apparatus, just the statement, what was the way you... Requiring breath to stay alive. You use your intellect and ask yourself, can I conceive in my mind of a person enduring without oxygen, surviving for 100 years? Can your mind conceive of that?
Yes.
No, I can't.
I can't.
I cannot.
Well, here's the thing. If you can't conceive of it, how can you say it's impossible? It's by the ability of conceiving it that you arrive at the understanding that this thing is rationally possible, impossible, or necessary. Square circle. A square circle. You can't imagine it. I mean, you can't draw it in your mind. But you can take the two terms, square and circle, merge them together and think about it, and realize from that that it is impossible, is rationally impossible. When you take the term human being and not breathing and you put them together, do they cancel each other out?
Yes.
Rationally, the same way a square circle would? No.
Yes, it's possible.
Or like you can take two pieces of stick.
I think there would
Or
be.
to put it in a different way, can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create a human being that doesn't require breath?
Yes,
That's what I'm
would
thinking
be
about.
a level.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if that's possible, that Allah Ta'ala could create a human being without breath or without requiring breath, it means that it is rationally possible. It's not necessary.
I got you.
I have something missing here. Are we doing rationally impossible or this all mixed up with now?
Well, yeah, in the examples you give, if you give an example for something that you think is rationally necessary, but it's not, we're going to find out where does it really fit.
I have very small, very like simple
I think she was talking
geometry
about it's
example.
impossible.
Rationally impossible.
She was saying rationally impossible, yes.
Very simple geometry example. A triangle cannot be a square.
Yes.
Just like that's very simple, like you know.
It- right. So the word cannot is
It's like
is impossible.
A is not B.
Right.
B is not. So what was the answer of the when she was saying human can't be?
It's rationally possible.
Yes, possible.
Good question. Good question. Did Prophet Yunus alayhi salam have oxygen in the whale? For what we know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sustained him, and everything about that incident was a miracle. Everything about it. Because when you look at how long he was there, the number of days, and the conditions, everything about it was a miracle. And a miracle, by definition, is khalqul ada. It's breaking the norm. So the ada, which is that you need oxygen, you need this amount of food and water to survive. If that's broken, if that norm is broken, what do you have? You have a miracle. So yeah. The miracles are the breaks of the ada, which means that all miracles are, by definition, rationally possible events.
So you can stay in the freezer overnight and still
Wouldn't he
be
have to be
alive.
alive because he was praying? La ilaha illallah.
That's the means, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sustained him in this miraculous way. So the
being alive in water because of John and not that being also impossible to be alive without water.
say
Water and being alive. That might be impossible.
in what sense?
You have like not like just thinking John and then night and the same time. Everything is
But are we saying it's empirically or rationally?
anything like plants, animals.
So this is a good. Your question opens a lot of interesting doors. I like it because number one, it's an ayah. But what is the ayah saying? Allah Ta'ala is saying in this verse that we've made everything alive from water. And what is the conclusion you're arriving to based on this verse? That it's
The opposite, that everything, like, if the equation goes this way, it doesn't necessarily go that way.
well. So if Allah Ta'ala reveals in this verse that every living thing in the world finds its primary substance, the building blocks from water, we ask ourselves, is it rationally possible that does Allah Ta'ala have the power to create living things that are not from water? Yes. So he's making a statement about the nature of creation, not stating that it has to be that way. That's not a rational statement, that it's rationally necessary. So Allah Ta'ala reveals in this ayah, describing the nature of life in the cosmos. This is a descriptive verse. It says nothing about it having to be that way. Right? If Allah willed to create a life from other substances, or not have any involvement with water, that power was with Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is a descriptive statement of how He created the substance, living substances. Yes.
Human as opposed to the other creation. I
So,
couldn't get past the dust verse from dust to
Because one would say, okay, the jinn.
smokeless fire.
smokeless fire.
Do jinn depend on water?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're creations that we have to believe in.
I mean, ultimately, that knowledge is accessed through wahi, through revelation. So the rational judgment isn't depending on revelation or depending on observation in nature. It's a rational judgment made in the mind. So I'll give you some examples and tell me what you think. All bachelors are unmarried. This is as a statement. It's if we look at it with under a microscope, we will technically call it a priori statement, but I want to use this example because it brings home the point I was making earlier about knowing your terms. What stands for A? What stands for B? So all bachelors are unmarried. So bachelors, does the word unmarried and bachelor, do they cancel each other out? Or are they different ways of expressing the same reality?
Different ways expressing.
Yeah.
Divorced
Divorced bachelor is someone who's a bachelor now, haliyan, and they're divorced because they were previously married. But a bachelor is by definition a man who is not married. If you say a bachelor is married, this is a contradiction in terms because bachelor is by definition one who's unmarried. That would be like saying that fulan is a married, unmarried person. A married, unmarried person. Each term contradicts the other. Each term cancels the other one out. Right?
Unless he's married and he acts like it.
Well, yeah, I mean. Yeah, we we could have cultural meanings for the terms. And that's funny, and it's also quite profound because it tells us that when we're looking at these terms, we can't just settle with the definition used in a particular comedic setting where it has to be used according to the precise definition of the term. So all bachelors are unmarried for sure. Another example. An object that is red all over and also green all over. Possible, necessary, or impossible? An object that is red all over and green all over at the same time.
So point A and B.
It could be in layers.
Hmm?
It could be in layers. You could have the apples on red all over this.
2D.
2D. It's a 2D?
2D.
Can we divide this into A and this sentence into two parts of A and B?
Rationally
And
I draw a square, a red square on the board, and I say this is a red square, it's red all over, and it's green all over.
No, it's
Rationally
said
impossible.
contradicting.
No.
It's if I draw a circle, it's red, and then I draw another one, it's green. So I can say it's
No,
red
there's two.
and green.
She said one circle. One
It's
object.
one object.
No, it's contradicting the two.
Yeah.
If you look both parts, they're contradicting each other.
Yes,
It's not. Yeah.
it contradicts each other.
This always helps me that part too. Otherwise,
Red all over and green all over.
No.
Because
So
you're
it's
saying
rationally
something is
impossible,
red,
yeah.
something's green, it's two,
Right.
yeah.
At the same time.
So it's rationally impossible. Yes. I think this is rationally impossible.
Okay, here's some examples. Tell me whether this is impossible or necessary, rationally. The four-sidedness of a square.
It's rationally necessary.
It's a serious.
The four-sidedness
Yes.
of a square
Yeah.
is necessary.
Yes, necessary.
It's in the very definition of the term.
Such
Right.
definition.
A part is smaller than the whole.
Yes. 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 Necessary.
Necessary.
Yes.
Why?
Because part is it's the definition of the whole.
Because the word part by definition means a piece of a whole. To say that it's otherwise is word salad. We're going to change the meaning of part to mean a monster truck, and then who knows what we're talking about. And this is why it's so important to understand what we mean by the terms, right? Whenever you have a discussion with someone, they disagree with you about something, and you disagree with them, and you're having a back and forth. 99% of the time, it's because both parties are speaking about a topic and they have their own definition for it that differs from the other, right? So a person says, I think there should be limitations on XYZ. And the other one says, no, there should be no limitations on XYZ. But for person A, XYZ means something entirely different from the way person B thinks of XYZ. You have to first define your terms. So the same thing here with the hukum, the rational judgment. Before we can make the rational judgment, we have to have an understanding of, well, what is it? What is A and what is B in that hukum? There's the nisba, A is B, A is not B. Well, what is A and what is B? I can't make a judgment about that until I know what is A and what is B. And when I know what A is and I know what B is, I can examine that proposition and determine, does it have to be that conclusion? Do they cancel each other out, or is it just possible? But before knowing what each term means, I can't make a judgment. And this is why we learn in Islam, one of the principles in Islamic law and in logic is al-hukmu ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. That the judgment you make about something is a branch of your conception of it. And you can't say, imagine a person goes to a mufti, qualified to give fatwa, and they say, yeah, Sheikh, what is the ruling of Allah concerning blah, 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 blah. Just whatever sound comes out of the mouth. What is that mufti supposed to say? Halal, haram, makruh, mustahab, mubah, wajib. The mufti cannot make a judgment until they determine what is blah, 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 whatever sound that person made. That sound could be a word, could be a term, it could be a concept. The mufti has to know, what do they mean by this? And when they understand what it means truly, then they can examine what is the hukum in sharia for that issue. It's the same thing for the rational judgments. I can't say that this thing is wajib, aqli, is rationally necessary or rationally impossible until I know, what is it? What is the meaning of A? What is the meaning of B? So when we talk about Aqidah, we are learning about who the Creator is. So we learn the necessary attributes of the Creator. When we say the name Lafzul Jalala, the divine name Allah, the divine has certain qualities that are necessary. Without those qualities, it by definition wouldn't be the divine. And it also follows that there's other qualities that are rationally impossible. To give a simple example, lacking power. Lacking power is impossible, rationally possible, with respect to the divine, with respect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're going to get into each of those, but before you can do that, we have to have a good conception of the rational judgments. Let's give a few more.
Can you repeat, the judgment you make about something is the branch of?
That's kind of a stilted translation, but it's basically saying that before you can make a judgment about something, whether it is positive, negative, rationally possible, necessary, whatever, you have to know what it is in the first place.
I'm just saying, did you say something is the branch of what you conceive it to be?
We say far'un an tasawwurihi in Arabic, which means that it's a derivative. It derives from how we conceive it. Before we can make the judgment, we have to have the conception of what it is in the first place. If I say, is there such a thing as a square circle? Is a square circle rationally impossible? You cannot say it is if you don't know what square means and you don't know what circle means. Suppose you speak Farsi, Persian, Farsi, and you don't know what the word square in English means or the word circle. Right? If I say, by any word you use in another language, that person doesn't know what the words mean. They have to know, what does this word square mean? And then they translate it into their own language. Okay, that translation, now they know what it is. They have tasawwur. From that tasawwur, this understanding of what it is, now they can make a judgment. They can't make a judgment before they know what it is. So when we say A is B, or is A B, we can't say yes or no until we know what is A and what is B. If we jump the gun and say it is without knowing what A is, or having a partial definition, we're going to make errors.
Is it also?
Biology confirmed that there is a great creator.
Biology is in the domain of science. It's one of the.
But it confirms that there is a creator.
It confirms in the sense that it indicates certain things, but in the domain of science is observation. The science itself doesn't make any metaphysical claims.
They just reach.
It just makes scientific claims based on observation. Now we can derive from that and observe those signs and then come to conclusions, but the science itself is not making the conclusion.
The only reason why I said that is because I took a biology class and I couldn't stop saying subhanAllah.
Right, because you're viewing it through the lenses of Iman. So you see these signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all being confirmed time and time again. Right.
Two things. Point A and B, you were saying we should know the terms, what they define. So for
Mhm.
example, A and B first this part and then make the judgment. So all it goes back to having correct knowledge. Then right knowledge, understanding, needed correct, then the good judgment.
Yes.
So much must go into the knowledge, correct, going back, and that's why we have the deen.
So right, and remember what we said in the beginning. There are these two important terms, tasawwur and tasdeeq. These two go hand in hand. Tasawwur is understanding, well, what is A and what is B, And after you have an understanding of what is A and B, you can make the tasdeeq. This thing is true or false, possible, impossible, necessary, halal, haram. But first you have to have the tasawwur. Without the tasawwur, there's no true tasdeeq. It's going to fall into error. A person may get it right, but it's going to be accidental because they didn't have a proper tasawwur of what the issue is.
Then one more thing, and there's a good point, like the biology doesn't lead. I think the science leads what mostly to the point of Mother Nature. They don't go to Creator. They don't say Creator. I don't hear this. Mother Nature you hear, but like we with the help we reach to Creator because of our deen and revelation.
Mhm.
That helps us. But if you took out that, it's just Mother Nature, and it doesn't go really to the Creator, not fully. It's Mother Nature, and it is somewhere incomplete.
Yeah, it's an issue in the modern world where science has been used to make metaphysical statements. It's gone beyond its own domain. And science is a great tool, it's a great rahmah, but it can also be a great danger. It could be a great danger if the person using the science is not guided by a higher morality. It can also be dangerous when it goes beyond its area of authority. It's concerned with the observable, with what is measurable, what is quantifiable, what you can observe. And it does not have a place making metaphysical statements about the nature of reality, what is true or false, moral or immoral. But people who are involved in science may overstep those bounds and make those kind of statements.
That's why you have to be so careful with your children going off to college, because they try to Islamitize
Yep, exactly.
quickly.
So are there any questions more about the rational judgment? I did draw something on the board, maybe a final example before we can parse through this. There's a drawing. You see a circle. Inside that circle is a square, and inside that square is a triangle. And each one has been assigned a letter. The circle is A. Circle is C, right? The triangle is A, the square is B, and the circle is C. If we say that A is part of B, correct?
Yes, correct.
And B is part of C, correct? Can we conclude, therefore, that A is part of C or inside of C?
Yes.
Yes. That's necessary. We see it, right? If someone says, no, it's not inside, it doesn't make any sense. We see it for what it is. So these are just some examples to think about. And
That is Zaruri, Nazari, and Wujud Zahni.
yeah, the last two, we talked about daruri and nadari. Daruri, we said, is self-evident. 1 + 1 = 2. That has to be. And it doesn't take much time to think about this. It comes very quickly. It is self-evident. It doesn't require ta'ammul wala nadar. It doesn't require reflection, contemplation. On the other hand, the nadari requires some measure of thinking, contemplation. Takes time. And that depends on the person as well. Some people may get something very quickly that takes a long time for others. It's all relative. Most of the rational judgments that we're making and learning about are nadari in nature. So they have to be unpacked a little bit. The last two terms are also quite important. And we're going to revisit them later on, but for today, the two terms are dhihni and khariji. What is this referring to? The dhihn is the mind. The dhihn is the mind. And the term dhihni Well, here it's wujud dhihni. It is the mental existence. What is a mental existence? If I ask you to think of a square circle, does that have wujud dhihni? A square circle, does it have wujud dhihni? Does it have a mental existence?
No, because there is no square.
Well, I mean, you can't imagine it as a shape. You can't imagine it as a shape, for sure. People are drawing some weird half circle, half square thing. Parts of it are round, parts of it are angled. That's not a square circle. But the term square circle combined, when you're asked about it, you think about it in your mind. So you do have not a literal mental image of a square circle, but the two terms combined, they do have a mental existence, because through that mental existence, you think about it and you realize, that's absurd. That's a rational impossibility. So when we say wujud dhihni, it doesn't mean it's a real existent. Doesn't mean it's real. It just means that you have the ability to put the two together and understand what each means and then realize that's rationally impossible.
But if you're saying something is existent,
Well,
that's what I'm saying, like, that's what
well,
I'm
when we
saying.
think of existence,
When I think of existence, I think that
Yeah,
it
in
is.
everything is different.
but there's levels of existence, that's the thing. And this is that's not really theology. Theology does touch on this, but it's actually what we call ontology. There's levels of existence. So for instance, you dream something. Does that dream have an existence?
Yes.
It does. Is it comparable to the physical existence in dunya? No, it's different. The barzakh, that's an existence. It's different from this kind of existence. But our existence is a ontological / cosmological existence. I don't want to get into this topic right now. But the point I'm making is that the word existence here doesn't mean concrete physicality and all of these things. It just means wujud dhihni, you can conceive of it. If there was no wujud dhihni, mental existence, you wouldn't be able to put the two terms together even and do tasawwur of square circle. It will just be blah, blah, it's nothing. So there's a wujud dhihni. So the impossible is what the aql cannot confirm as an actual existent. Fi nafs al-amr. Doesn't mean what the mind cannot conceive mentally when putting the two terms together. You put the two terms together, you can mentally conceive of those two terms together. But what's the conclusion you arrive at? You arrive at the conclusion that it's a rational impossibility that such a thing could exist in the extra mental existence, the wujud khariji, external existence, an actual existence. So,
Extra mental existence,
Can you give example for this?
square circle.
Extra?
Yeah, square circle.
This one's
You put the two terms together in your mind, you understand what square means. You understand what circle means. You put the two together in your mind, you realize that each term, by definition, cancels out the meaning of the other. So such a thing cannot exist externally in reality.
So there's no extra mental existence, but there is wujud dhihni.
Yeah,
Wujud dhihni.
not in the word, but
There is no extra mental existence for that.
Yeah, we don't want to confuse things and say that wujud dhihni is what you can imagine, literally. You can imagine a 7,000 headed dragon. Like you can literally imagine that, and if you wanted to take that imagination and put it onto paper, you could even do that. And it has an external existence insofar as it's on paper as a drawing. You can't take a square circle and give it extra mental existence on paper, even as a drawing. But in your head, you can at least put the two words together and think about them and understand that that's impossible. All right? The reason why we distinguish between the extra-mental and the mental existence is because if it was not possible to combine A and B in any way to understand in our minds, we couldn't make a judgment one way or the other. You couldn't say, oh, it's wajib, it's necessary, or it's impossible. How can you say it's impossible or impossible until you've done tasawwur? So the tasawwur is done aqlan, in your mind, in your rational faculty, and that kind of existence is not a real existence, but it's a mental existence where you're able to put them together. It's cognitive. It's a cognitive existence where, okay, I'll give you a good example. I'll give you a better example than the square circle. Multiple gods existing besides Allah. Can the mind conceive of that? Plenty of people conceive of it and actually believe it to be true. We call them idol worshippers.
Yes, they are.
As a mental conception, a person can conceive of it in the mind. Obviously, that's rationally impossible, as we're going to learn in detail later on. But the point we're making here is the wujud dhihni isn't a real existence. It's just a way of, it's the ability to conceive of something. And through conceiving it, you're able to understand, make a judgment that that thing is necessary, impossible, or possible. Right?
I want to give you an illustration, a real live one. My face can turn into a monster.
You put me in a tight spot, because if I say that's, if you say that's rationally possible,
It's right. Well, why? Because if you have angioedema, and you have a certain your face will go like this, and you will say, ah!
I would.
And it's true, because it happened to me. I was in intensive care last year.
Rational possibility.
I
Yeah.
mean, it blew up, man. It actually structured it down. It dropped everything.
The metamorphosis.
You actually can look like a monster. It's true.
Rationally possible.
Yeah.
No? Okay, I'll give you another example. I have $100, and you ask me, who gave me the $100? I say, Zaid gave me the $100. You go to Zaid, where did you get the $100? He said, Amr gave it to me. You go to Amr, who gave you the $100? He says, Abdul Aziz gave me the $100. You go to me. Who gave you the $100? Zayd gave it to me. No matter how many times you go around, it's circular. Who printed the money? Right? So the idea that this is circularity, dawr, it's a rational impossibility we're going to learn about later on. Dawr is an example of dawr. A created B, B created C, C created A. It's a vicious circle. Your mind can conceive of that idea of the $100 from me, I got from Zayd, Zayd got from Amr, Amr got from me, and it goes around in the circle for infinity. Your mind can conceive of that, but can that be an actual reality? No. Same thing for infinite past events. How many miles does it take to get from here to Philadelphia? It takes an infinite number of miles. Your mind can conceive of a person driving an infinite number of miles. I mean, the idea at least, but that's not a possibility rationally, because it means they never get there. Because once you've gone however many zillions of miles, there's always one more mile to add, because it's infinity. So the mind can conceive of that, at least putting the words together, so it has that mental existence, but it doesn't have an actual extra mental real existence. So I want you to understand that, because when we say that the rational impossibility cannot be conceived as existing, we don't mean conceived in the mind, we mean conceived in reality. The mind can conceive of it as an idea. If the mind wasn't able to do that, it could make a judgment about it. Does that make sense? Okay. Khair. And
Can you give or maybe another next class that little bit of this extra mental existence? They all both are related, mental existence, and then it comes extra mental existence. So how we reach extra mental? When we create that, it's all extra.
okay, a purple square. Can you conceive of that in your mind? Can you discover a purple square in the present world we're in? That has a mental existence as well as an extra mental existence. A black purse, you can conceive of that in your mind, and it has an extra mental existence. Extra mental existence, think about it. Khariji means kharij, external to you, in the world, right? Some certain things you can conceive in your mind, but they don't have an extra mental existence.
The problem is if you look at the word extramental,
Yeah.
the definition, this is what confused me, because extramental,
Extra means beyond,
outside, beyond the mind,
beyond the mind, external.
right? So when we're looking at definition of terms,
Yeah. What does extra mental mean?
Yeah.
Extra means beyond, mental means the mind, so beyond your mind, external to your mind. Yes. The black purse, you can conceive of it in your mind, and it also has an external existence. External from what? External from your mind that conceives of it.
But don't you think like that when you think of the law? He is so great in everything that he's made that past the throne, there has to be something more.
Well, we're going to get to that when we talk about the
I can't fathom where he's at, man.
well,
He's somewhere up there. He's way up there.
well, Allah Ta'ala is not bound by physical location, as we're going to learn.
But I'm just saying.
The existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His wujud, His existence, is the first thing we learn about when we learn about our aqidah. It's actually going to be in the next class. And we learn that the wujud of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what we call an ontological existence and not a cosmological existence. And we explain the two terms in some detail, inshaAllah. Cosmological meaning the cosmos, the world, material, matter, measurable. That's the cosmos. Cosmological. Ontological is being, existence as such. So we're going to talk about that in the next class, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And you're going to keep hearing the terms rationally possible, impossible, necessary, but it's all going to be in relation to the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His attributes, and the opposites of those attributes, and the things that are possible.
So this is ilahiyat that we're studying then? Ilahiyat.
Sorry, I had two questions that came at the same time.
So just for extramental existence, it's just purpose where you can imagine it and it exists. Simple.
Or square circle, but that doesn't have,
That's mental.
yeah. But it's also, you can call that a mental existence because you can conceive of it. Not that you can draw it in your mind and imagine it, but you can at least put the two terms together and see, they don't add up. That can't exist.
But what's extramental?
Yeah, wujud khariji, external to your aql.
We can see.
Hmm?
We can see.
Extra thought.
Well, thought is the process, I suppose, ta'aqqul, intellection. But when we say mental existence, just think of your mind or intellect conceiving of it. 1 + 1 = 17. Your mind, in your mind's eye, you can put those together Can't you?
450, equal to.
But does it have an actual reality behind it? No. So this is important. And the reason why this is important is because there's a fundamental misunderstanding a lot of people have when they study Aqidah. They think that the rational impossibility is something that cannot be imagined in the mind. And it comes from a misreading of the text. It's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that it cannot be, its existence cannot be conceived as a real existence. Obviously, if the mind couldn't conceive of it, how can it make a judgment about it one way or the other? Right? 1 + 1 = 17. If you don't, suppose you speak Farisi and you hear that, you can't do any tasawwur of this because it's a foreign language. So how can you make a judgment about it? Right? But if you know what the terms mean, you can at least put them in your mind and think about it. And in that sense, you're able to reach the conclusion that it's possible, impossible, or necessary. Doesn't mean that you're imagining a square circle as an actual thing, but you're putting the terms together. And then from there, you realize, that can't be external to my conceiving of it. I know that can't actually exist. It's not a rational possibility because both terms cancel each other out, right?
But the example is Daniel, right? But the example that she gave in the beginning, saying that a purple square,
Right.
you can mentally.
That's an example of something that is both has a mental existence and an extra mental existence.
She was right in what she said.
Yeah, I was just clarifying that it's not limited to what we can imagine.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I just wanted to, because I kind of understood things the way she was saying it, but
Yeah.
I got a little confused after the discussion. So, okay.
You think of a nice sumptuous dinner in your mind. You have all the ingredients put together. That's a mental existence. When you go and cook it, it becomes an extra mental existence. Alhamdulillah. So next class, inshallah, we'll go right into the content of the Aqidah, inshallah. And if there's any questions lingering from this area, we can address those as well.
These last two, mental and extra, looks like this one step, the second is extra mental, when it happened and we can see. Look, most examples like with food and the purple circle and when it appears, which will be khariji, so it means it has to be there, outside, right? But the first mental X-ray is little different than the second because that is, we can try to, and then we reach, is it possible or not, and then we make the judgment. So both, but I think wujud khariji, it has to be there.
So it has to be, but it's definitely a possibility. A purple square can exist. It might exist. Might not exist. It's possible. Either way. Yeah. But if it existed, it's possible to exist external to our minds, outside of our aql. Yeah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum.